chopped in two, sliced in half, cloven asunder. If God asked you to bring him or to gather these assorted animals and these two birds, would your response be to gather them, to chop them in half, and to lay them out beside each other? Today, I'm going to speak on Genesis chapter 15, a chapter where God and Abram has an encounter with God. God meets with Abram. And there's this really strange covenant ceremony. I guess in our mind, maybe when we read this, we think, oh, it's the Old Testament, so there's sacrifices and stuff. But when you just look at the text, God just tells him, gather these animals. And then Abram goes and cuts them in half and lays them out, and it's this whole thing. And so, to me at least, when I read that, it's a little bit strange, right? It's what's going on here. So we're going to look at that. My hope is, as we work through this passage today, I want you to see a few things. I want you to see how God's character shapes this encounter between God and Abram. I want you to see how this covenant that God and Abram make, how it is very meaningful to Abram. There is a little bit of foreshadowing even of Jesus' sacrifice that is to come. And this, in Genesis 15, just a little ways into the Old Testament, there's some hints in how this covenant plays out, some foreshadowing of what's to come. So we'll touch on that briefly. And then at the end, I want to just kind of ponder a little bit together, and I'll share some thoughts that I've had about what might this mean for us today as we pray, as we connect with God. I'm going to drop that out of the way, and I will pray, and then we can dive in. Father God, thank you for today. Thank you that we can gather here, that we can worship you. I pray that we would have open hearts. Father, I pray that I would speak your words. Thank you for speaking to me and leading and guiding me as I prepared this today. Amen. Tsenia, can you turn down this mic a little bit? It's the number 21, I think. If you just put the slider that's in the middle down a little bit. Yep, perfect. Up a little bit. Perfect. Yep, that's good. The travails of not being in the booth myself, but luckily I have a wonderful assistant. So I'm actually going to start by jumping back to chapter 12. And so this is when God first calls Abram. So I'll just read these first three verses here. Chapter 12 of Genesis. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So God calls Abram. He says that he is going to be a great nation, and through him, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And Abram is actually 75 when this occurs in chapter 12. He's 75. He's already getting up there in age, but God calls him to move, to go. And so Abram goes, and as he goes along, he has a few different encounters. He starts to gather some wealth, and as we move along, In chapter 14, just a little recap, because chapter 15 starts with after these things, right? It's kind of referring to after chapter 14, now this is what happens. So just to give you a little bit of a recap, in chapter 14, Abram's nephew Lot was taken. There was a war going on. He was taken. So Abram goes, he rescues him, and then he essentially, there's the option to have some spoils, some reward, and he says, nope, I don't want to take those because I don't want to, this person who's offering them the reward, he says, I don't want you to be able to say, you're the reason why I am rich. So that's kind of a little bit of the very brief notes of what has come before this. And so he has some wealth that he's gathered. He's doing pretty well for himself at this time, but he still doesn't have any children. And so after this, we dive into chapter 15. And at the start of chapter 15 here, the word of the Lord comes to Abram. God speaks to him. And he says, don't fear, I am a shield to you, your reward shall be very great. And so he is promising protection and reward for Abram. And Abram responds. He says, God, what can you give me? Like at this point, he is already fairly well-to-do, but in this time, in this place, family is very important. And he says, you can give me more stuff, but to me, that's not actually going to be that great because I don't have a son to pass this on to. His desire is to have a son, to carry on his family name, and also to hand his wealth over to. So just having greater riches isn't really what Abram is especially interested in right now. It's hard to be a great nation like God has promised that he will be when he doesn't have children to expand his family. Abram calls out God a bit and says, hey, you promised me this and it hasn't happened yet. And so we move on. And does God rebuke Abram? No. Instead, he brings him outside. And God tells him to look up at the stars. To look up at the stars and to count them. It says, and he took him outside, this is God took him outside, and said, now look toward the heavens and count the stars, if you are able to count them. And he said to him, so shall your descendants be. Then he, that is Abram, believed in the Lord, and he, God, reckoned it to him as righteousness. Have you ever gone outside? Maybe you were in the country somewhere or in a park or something where there's not very many lights. On a clear night and just looked up and looked at the stars and marveled at how many stars there are. And as you look up, you look here and maybe you start counting the stars and then you see some out of the corner of your eye, so you look over there and then you start counting. And as you count, your eyes focus and more stars appear, right? You see some out of your periphery, and then as you focus in, you see more and more stars. And so I can just imagine Abram just looking up, and I'm sure it's very dark there, right? Maybe there's a campfire or something, but there's no big LED lights shining into the sky. And he's just looking, and he's, trying to count the stars, but that's an impossible task. The more you look, the more you see. And so God promises, so shall your descendants be. Abram still doesn't have any children, but he looks at the vastness and the wonder of these stars, and he has faith. He believes that God is going to come through. And God counts that as righteousness to Abram. And then, so Abram is kind of, we'll call it appeased. He has some measure of peace here. He has faith that, yes, God will bring me descendants. And then the Lord mentions another promise that he's made. He says, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. And then Abram again, he with the descendants, he said, God, you haven't given me a descendant. I don't have any sons. What's up with that? And God meets him and brings him outside, and Abram has faith. And even with that, now when we're coming to talk about the land, again, Abram says, O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? He's still looking for some sort of assurance or sign or proclamation or something kind of greater than what God has already given him for possessing the land. And so even though Abram had faith with the descendants, he's still asking God, hey, can I have a little bit more? And so God asks him to gather up these animals. And so Abram gathers these animals. God says, gather the 3-year-old heifer, the 3-year-old female goat, the 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, a young pigeon. That's all that, at least recorded, we have that God asks him to do. And so Abram gathers these animals, he chops them in half, he lays them out, he's beating off the vultures and everything. It seems like he is waiting for God to arrive. And what's up with that? Like, how did he come to do that, right? How did he know that this was what he was supposed to do? Or was this what he was supposed to do? Well, let me ask you this. If God asked you to gather a diamond ring and 2 gold bands, and that's all he said, would you kind of have an idea of what might be going on, what the plan might be? I think we all know those are things that we would associate with a certain ceremony, with engagement and wedding, right? So we would know this is kind of what we're preparing for. And so God asks Abram to gather these animals, and Abram knows exactly what's going on. And so he acts accordingly. For us, or at least for me, when I read it, before I read some commentaries and got a little bit of the historical background, I'm just reading it going, okay, well, I don't quite know what's going on here. Why is Abram doing this? I guess he knew what to do, right? But Abram, this was something that was familiar to him. So what I want to do is I'm going to pause for a little bit, and I'm going to explain a bit of the historical context as far as the documents that we have of this time and this place, because we do have a historical covenants that mirror this covenant ceremony that Abram and God have. And so I'll tell you a little bit kind of the historical context for these covenants. And then we can dive in and look at, okay, so given that historical context, what would this covenant have meant to Abram? And then also the covenant that Abram and God have, it takes a little bit of a turn. It looks a little bit different than what the historical one would look like. So we'll delve into that and explore that a little bit as well. So historically, in this time, in this place, we have documents recording a couple of different types of covenant. So really, in this area, family was very important. So for these people groups in this time, in this place, family is kind of king, and that's their framework for how they live their lives. So when you have these different nations or people groups, if they are trying to figure out how to interact with other nations or other people groups, they would basically do it in terms of family. So their becoming allies or their political agreements would be in the form of these covenants, which would essentially be adding that other nation as into their family. It would be giving them a familial relationship, so they would know how to treat each other. So there were two different types of covenants. There was one where it would be between two nations or peoples of equal power, and that would basically be a brother-to-brother relationship. So you're of equal power, you kind of have equal rights. You're just, gonna not, attack the other person or something, right? It's just kind of mutually beneficial. We agree to act like brothers. And then there was the father-son one. And this one was where one party was much more powerful and one was weaker. And in this one, it would be, you would have the more powerful one, the weaker one. The weaker one would essentially gain protection from the more powerful one, because the more powerful one, like a father, provides for a son. So would the more powerful nation. They would say, okay, we'll provide for you, we'll protect you, we'll make sure that you're prosperous, because it's in the best interests of the father or the powerful nation, and they also get something out of it as well, right? The more powerful nation, they could ask for the weaker nation to aid them in their wars. They would have tributes, so whatever crops or animals or trade goods that the weaker nation would be making or gaining, they would send some of that off to the more powerful nation. So it was in some ways it was a good deal for the weaker nation, because they have the protection and the provision of the stronger nation, but there were, you have to pay for it as well. And it would be a singular covenant, which is to say that one weaker nation would only have this type of deal or covenant with one type of stronger nation. It would be seen as a betrayal if they would go to a second strong nation and have that type of agreement with them as well. So it was basically, nope, we're family now. You're my father nation, and I am with you. So there were lots of kind of little people groups in and around the Israel area where Israel would eventually be. And there were some greater nations like Egypt to the south that would often be trading through there. And so the little nations would kind of ally themselves with one or the other of the big nations. And obviously the big nations, they would want you only with me, don't go trying to play both sides. So that's kind of the historical context of this covenant that Abram and God are doing here. And so for Abram, you might have already thought through some of these things, but so for Abram, with this covenant that God has basically said, hey, let's do this covenant ceremony. With this is God coming to Abram and saying, I will provide for you, I will protect you, right? And so this is exactly what he asked for when he said, how will I know that I will possess this land? It's basically God saying, here is a form that you are familiar with. We will do this, and it will bring peace to Abram, because he knows, God is now committed, and he will bring this about. And so it is it is, if it wasn't clear, it is this father-son covenant that Abram and God are going through. God as the father figure, Abram as the son. So God is the powerful one, Abram is the weaker one. And as a part of this ceremony, there's various pieces of it, and in the historical context, they would normally take animals that were viewed in their religion as being, pure or special, and they would actually cut them in half and lay them. So that was very much a form that was familiar. And then in the ceremony, the weaker person, the representative from that nation, the weaker one would actually walk between the animals, and that would basically be a sealing of the covenant, and as well, it would actually be them essentially declaring, "So shall it be done to me if I would break this covenant." So they're basically saying, I am going to stay true to you, the stronger one, and if I, refuse to send you soldiers when you ask, or refuse to give you your tribute that I owe you, or if I would make another covenant with someone else who is a strong nation, then I would expect you to come in and there would be repercussions. We would be slaughtered and torn apart like these animals. So it was a very visual representation of kind of the consequences of the breaking of this covenant. And so up until verse 17, we're going through this covenant. It's looking fairly similar to what the normal historical context would be. But then we get to verse 17, and it says, "It came about when the sun had set that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and a flaming torch, which passed between these pieces," the animals. And so this is a break from the norm. This is not how it's supposed to happen. God strays from what the normal ceremony would look like. God is the one who walks between the animals. And here God is seen as a smoking oven and a flaming torch. And smoke and fire are two different ways that God will often appear to the children of Israel in the Bible. So here, God, his form is one that is often shown in the Old Testament, smoke and fire, and so he goes between the animals. This is very interesting. That is supposed to be Abram walking there. The weaker party is supposed to seal the covenant and say, "So shall it be done to me." But God does it. And if we think about it, is there anywhere else in the Bible where God takes the place of a weaker party? Thinking about this covenant, ultimately, does his descendants, do they break this deal with God? Do they pursue other gods? And even just generally, us as humanity, do we pursue other gods? Do we break away from having just a covenant just with God? And what are the repercussions from that? Well, God takes the place of the weaker. God comes down to earth as Jesus, as a man. Jesus is torn and killed because of the broken covenant, because of the broken relationship. And so, to me, it was very interesting how already in Genesis 15, there's this foreshadowing, or just kind of a little picture of, in this ceremony with Abram, God, it's by his power, he's the one who's sealing the covenant, not Abram, and he's also taking the place of the weaker. And I think that's really neat that we can see a little bit of a foreshadowing of what's to come and what God's plan is and how things are all going to work out and how God will redeem us through Jesus and his sacrifice. And I think, yeah, it's just really neat that is there already at, pretty early on in Genesis. So that's the covenant. That's, the meaning for Abram. This is exactly kind of what he asked for. He said, God, I want to know, how can you tell me that I will actually possess this land? And so God brings forward this covenant. They make this covenant. And so Abram now knows, okay, God's going to provide for me. So we've looked at that. We've looked at how there's a bit of foreshadowing towards Jesus. And so circling back to my opening statements, what I wanted us to gain looking at this passage, I haven't really talked about God's character yet. So I want to look at that just a little bit here before we close off. So if we knew nothing about God other than what we see just in chapter 15, if we just read chapter 15 and we asked, who is God? What is his character? What would we find? And that's kind of what I asked myself. And there were three things that stood out to me. And I think you could gather more things. You could obviously label them differently. But these are the three things that I chose from this passage that were standing out to me. So the first one is that God communicates. It starts right off with God talking to Abram. The word of the Lord came to Abram. So God speaks to Abram, and Abram speaks to God, and God listens and interacts. So there is communications. God addresses Abram's concerns about the descendants. He brings him outside. And then as well, the concerns about possessing the land, he says, let's do this covenant ceremony. And so that very much brings us to point number 2, God cares. God doesn't just push off Abram. He doesn't just say, whatever, you're not having faith, but that doesn't matter, right? He doesn't rebuke Abram. He actually says, here, let me bring you outside. Let me show you the stars. Maybe looking at the stars, if you were a 75-year-old guy, wouldn't convince you, okay, great. Now I know I'm going to have many descendants. But apparently for Abram, it was enough. And that's pretty cool, that because of this, Abram has faith. And it is a true faith. Like, God counts it to him as righteousness. So this isn't just like, okay, yeah, I believe you. Like, it's a true, actual, real faith that Abram has. And God cares because he meets Abram where he's at. He brings forward, so this covenant ceremony is clearly something that Abram's familiar with. It's something that is relevant to his time and his place. And so God meets Abram in his time and place with something that is relevant and meaningful to Abram. And it connects with him, and it gives him that peace that he knows, okay, now I know God will provide for me. He meets in a way that will resonate with Abram. And I find that's just so neat, because God doesn't need to meet Abram exactly come down kind of to Abram's level and have this covenant that Abram will know, right? He could just say, I'm God and I've, I say I'll do it, right? But he has that compassion and that consideration and meets with Abram in a way that he understands and that is meaningful to him. And finally, God is powerful. If God is willing to make this agreement, to make this covenant, if God is willing to promise these things to Abram, well, clearly he must be powerful enough that he can actually bring them about, that they're actually going to happen. And just the God bringing about the many descendants and the possession of the land, it's quite a story in the Bible, and you can see God's power at work throughout it. And so I would say that this passage as well, to me at least, shows that God is powerful. And so how might this affect our prayer lives? How does the fact that God communicates, that God cares, and that God is powerful, how might that affect how we will pray, how we will talk with God, how we will listen to him? And I think as I've been thinking about these things, as I was thinking about Jordan's sermon from last week, I've been encouraged. I am not going to fully understand God. I'm not going to fully understand his character, even just from, one passage. Just looking at one passage isn't going to give me a complete understanding of God's character. But I think that even just in this one passage, there are, three that I pulled out, good truths about who God is. And I think, for me, the fact that God communicates is important. He desires that I come to him with my fears, my questions, my concerns, my requests. And he cares for me, and I don't need to convince him to listen to me. He's there, ready to listen. And as I was thinking about this as well, I was kind of looking at that list, and then I was thinking about how Abram experienced God, and God called Abram when he was 75 years old. Back in chapter 12, when God first calls Abram, he's 75 years old. And then there's a few little interactions with God in chapter 13, I think. There's an interaction, and then he speaks here now in chapter 15, and then there's the covenant of circumcision. So Abram still interacts with God in the following years, but it's not until he's at 100 that he actually has his son. And so it's a full third, or 25 years, of his life since when he first heard from God to when he actually has a son and sees the start of that promise of more descendants. And so I think even though I can say, okay, God communicates, God cares, God is powerful, we can think, okay, so I'll pray and it will be answered because God cares and he's powerful. And then I was also like, yes, but how many prayers do I have that I'm willing to wait 25 years to get the answer to it? And so I think I kind of tempered my, maybe it's the vending machine type of thought of, I'll just pray and God will answer and it'll be great. But that even if God communicates, God cares, and God is powerful, that doesn't necessarily mean that a prayer is going to be answered that instant, or even that year, or even that decade. It might be many years in the future before God supplies that answer. You might have different takeaways from this, and that's good, I think. We're all coming from a different place. We're all in a different place. And so your takeaways, even your thoughts of what aspect of God's character you see from this chapter, it might not be those three that I chose out. And that's okay. We can be different, and I believe that God can speak different things through the Bible to each of us. Those are just the ones that stood out to me. And to end, I just want to end on this thought that the weather is looking like it's going to be real warm. So I'm guessing overnight, once it gets dark out, it's not going to be freezing cold anymore. So maybe just take a moment sometime this week and poke your nose outside if you're still awake when it's dark outside. Poke your nose outside and just look up and just marvel at the stars for a little bit. Just take a look at these glorious stars that God has created and just marvel at them and at this God that we can know. This God that communicates with us, he cares for us, and he is so powerful. Amen.